everyone. I'm Gordon Haff, technology evangelist at Red Hat, and I'm here with my colleague Lucy today to talk about security. Lucy, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Lucy Kerner. I'm the Security Global Strategy and Evangelism Director at Red Hat. I lead security thought leadership, the technical go-to-market strategy, messaging, and evangelism for security across Red Hat's entire portfolio globally.
Lucy, I'm sure some of our viewers are very familiar with open source software. Others may be a little less so. So I'd like to get one thing out of the way up front. How can open source be secure if potential attackers can scour the source code looking for weaknesses and anyone can generally submit changes to that code?
Yeah, great question, Gordon. So, open source, brings those advantages, such as access to the latest innovation, transparency, collaboration, cost savings, potentially higher quality software since more eyes are on the code. But you really need to put safeguards in place to consume open source securely. Especially now, like organizations are consuming cloud technologies more and more, right? And oftentimes this means giving developers more and more control of the full development lifecycle. They're able to download images directly from the internet, or they're able to use container security tooling directly. Things like this, spin up Amazon instances. But developers aren't security experts, so this can lead to challenges if mitigations aren't in place. And so security gates if they're not in place. So, for example, about 3 years ago, tainted crypto mining container images from Docker Hub were downloaded. I think it was like over 5 million times, or even more recently, the SolarWinds attack. And so many companies decide to download and use open source software. In fact, that's a huge part of their, the software they use. They want to save time and money, and as opposed to buying commercial software based on open source projects, they may figure that what they give up in security, they're getting making it up with cost savings and agility. So while that may be true, if you decide to do that, make sure you do the following. So number one, have a method for inventorying the scope of open source usage in your organization. Have the ability to assess the security impact of each vulnerability. Have the resources in place to quickly find and fix vulnerabilities and quickly update all the affected systems as the latest version that includes the fix. Make sure which vulnerabilities matters and which ones are like security researchers just trying to make themselves famous at Black Hat. Just because it has a famous name, it doesn't mean that it's something you have to worry about. Put a SDLC, a secure development lifecycle, in place where you're regularly doing things like code and vulnerability scanning, extensive quality engineering testing per release. And so the reality is that even though many projects upstream has some testing systems for code submission and merge, it's far from ideal when we look at enterprise-grade quality and security. Upstream projects usually have very narrow testing scope to the most simple configurations. Definitely not enough to scale, and they do most basic hardening of servers are applied. And these and more make upstream testing good for first level testing, but definitely not enough to satisfy enterprise needs.
So, Lucy, you sort of alluded to how organizations are transitioning to public clouds, to hybrid clouds, and the fact that they're just using more open source software. This is a new world. How should we be tackling security differently?
Yeah, great question. So as you stated, as more organizations are moving to introducing new technologies that hybrid cloud and cloud technologies brings, in addition to what we talked about, making sure that you're consuming open source technology securely, because all of these technologies are open source as well. Many of them, at least, right? If we talk about Kubernetes, for example, right? So some of the challenges organizations face include the challenges that organizations face when introducing any new technology, right? So you want to make sure to do things like bring your security teams early in the evaluation process of which cloud technologies organizations should adopt. That way, you're figuring out how to secure hybrid cloud environments in a proactive versus bolt-on approach. also, from many times what I've seen, organizations struggling with securing cloud and hybrid cloud, we're also struggling on premise. So, for example, misconfigurations. It's a leading cause of breaches out there, including cloud security breaches. However, this is not really done in a proactive way in many organizations. So. Make sure that you have a strategy in place to tackle these low-hanging fruit issues like misconfigurations. Do things like automated config management and codifying configurations. Make sure that you're doing things like what we talked about, mitigating software supply chain risks by having a strategy to consume open source software securely. Have a strategy for data security and managing and protecting and gaining visibility to that data, maintaining that compliance and governance of hybrid cloud, because security policies that may make sense in your physical and virtual environment does not make sense all the time in a cloud environment. So you need to evaluate that, and you need to codify how you do compliance. You want to manage and have visibility in a hybrid cloud environment as well. Do things like integrating your visibility tools into a SIEM. Move to identity-centric model, like AWS CISO has said. Perimeter-based security does not work in the cloud. Identity is the new perimeter. You take a hard look at the security tooling and practices you have in place. While it may make sense, have made sense in a physical virtual environment, it may not make sense in a cloud environment. Like I was at a one customer, healthcare customer, who was using a traditional tooling to manage their containerized environment, where containers are coming up and down and up and down, and they were trying to track IP addresses. Right, that kind of tooling and methodology does not work in a cloud environment. So you need to really take a hard look at the tooling and practices you have in place. You want to scale management, because there's so many things you have to manage. You has to be in an automated manner. You want to implement an automation strategy. Everything in the cloud is automated. So you want to make sure you have an automation strategy that's consistent across the organization, and so that you are tackling common human errors such as misconfiguration issues. Don't forget about security is about not just technology and tools, it's about people and process. So you want to make sure you have a strategy to tackle the people and process problem for securing hybrid cloud, and by not just throwing more bodies at the problem as well.
So you mentioned data, and I think sometimes we think about the code in the case of open source a lot, but it's also very important to protect and manage that data, particularly in a distributed hybrid type of environment. Tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, definitely. You definitely want to have a strategy for protecting and managing, gaining visibility to that data. So first of all, find out, where does that data actually reside in your environment? Decide, is that the right place for that data to be stored? The other important thing to do is to categorize that data, categorize it into low, medium, and highly sensitive. So I've seen actually some organization delegate less sensitive data to the hybrid cloud, to the public cloud, and then highly sensitive data to their private cloud or their on-premise environment. But even less sensitive data in your public cloud should be secured as much as possible. You don't want to end up like there's this one big financial institution who put their data on AWS S3 storage. That led to a data breach, right? It had all of their sensitive customer data on it, and it was actually just posted on the hacker's personal GitHub page, which the organization never found out until they got an anonymous email sent by a security researcher, right? So you don't want to be in that situation. You also, make sure that you're leveraging all of the vast security tooling by your public cloud service provider. For example, they have tools like data tagging, data identification, key management service. AWS, for example, has a centralized security console called Security Hub. Take advantage of existing technologies you already have, like, for example, your operating system. Your operating system has things like access control lists, for example. We have in Enterprise Linux has access control lists and encryption and data security to address these data security issues. Look at things like enabling access controls, things like SC Linux, things like encryption for data at rest with LUKS. Look at things like encryption over the wire with TLS and IPsec. Make sure that your secrets are encrypted within the cloud and within your application as well.
Lucy, you mentioned financial services, which is sort of a classic example of a regulated industry. How do those kind of industries and others maintain compliance and governance?
Right. In a hybrid cloud, especially, right, you want to look at the policies, hybrid cloud and cloud, look at the security policies you already have in place and see if it makes sense in a cloud or a containerized and Kubernetes environment. A classic policy that many organizations have to comply with, that's in many security standards out there is, you must install antivirus on all your systems. This may make sense in a virtual and physical environment, but it does not make sense in a containerized environment where the container host itself is immutable. Also, just like you're doing, you should be doing infrastructure and security as code for that, for that consistency, that repeatability, that auditability. You want to make sure you do compliance as code as well. That way, you're codifying and automating the way you're doing compliance at scale for both auditing and remediation.
Sort of at the beginning, you mentioned about people and process challenges, especially as it relates to hybrid cloud and processes like DevSecOps. Can you elaborate how organizations should tackle these challenges?
Yeah, so security is not just about products and technology, right? It's a people, process, and technology problem. That's a famous quote actually from Bruce Schneier, right? American cryptographer. So you want to tackle the cybersecurity research problem not just by throwing more bodies at the problem, but tackling it across people, process, technology. Cloud security architects and engineers are probably one of the hardest, actually, they are one of the hardest resources to hire today. And so do things like build a cyber resilient team by growing your cybersecurity resources, from within, by further developing your existing IT and development and IT professionals. Develop that culture of cross collaboration, cross training across the organization. Have the developers teach the security teams and vice versa. Have lunch and learns. I've seen some organizations do things like all go to escape rooms together to solve security challenges. Also implement that consistent automation strategy like we talked about, because you want to get rid of those repetitive tasks that lead to human error, that lead to problems like misconfigurations, which are the leading causes of breaches. And also all of this, doing all of this is actually taking that baby step approach to do DevSecOps successfully and actually making it real in your organization. So how else can you scale your teams? More and more, these third-party security vendors are adding things like AI and ML technologies to automate things you may be doing in your security operations center. Organizations are also leveraging third-party service providers, such as cloud managed service cloud managed service providers, and also security managed service providers to augment their security and cloud staff as well.
Well, thank you, Lucy.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. It was great. Thanks for the conversation.